Ladies and gentlemen, is the sound on? It works. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here today, to be allowed to present some of my hobby themes. It's always always get you happy when somebody is interested in the same thing as you are, and at least the audience today sounds like there are people interested in this subject. I will start talking a bit about the Hakka miners and about the mines in Bau, which sparked the whole interest when we started discovering these different mines and try to get into as many of them as possible. So I'll talk about that first. Then I will come a bit into the Sambas Sultanate, because these miners came from the Sambas side. So what was this sultanate on the site, and how did that coordinate and function with the Hakka miners? Then we'll go into the history of these mining kongsis in West Kalimantan, and end, of course, with the situation where they come to Sarawak. Afterwards, we'll see how far we get. Time's running. We will show pictures from tours around West Kalimantan to find the remains, whatever should be left from that Kongsi time. So we will have a tour around the area there, and then we'll have an end and conclusion of the story. But I'm told to not to talk too long, so I will start immediately about this. That was the other way. So the area which we talk about is this Sambas connection. And if we look at the original size of Sarawak and compare it to Sambas, it very much looks like the tip of Borneo. It looks like one area, right? It's that's divided somehow in the middle, but it's basically one area. And that's another thing I've been dealing a lot with. This is the relation between these two parts, how much it actually worked together. But the interest in the Bau mines, of course, what we see today is not from the Hakka miners. That's newer. That's from the Borneo Company mining periods. But it's not. It was still exciting to try to find all these old mines you could discover, and we did that for some years. Got to remember which way. And here we find some of these holes. You had to find out what's in there. Some of them are quite big. And of course, from inside, they're also quite big. It's a huge, and some of them you still find the machinery. And some are really adventurous to get far into. Today, still a tiny little bit of gold mining is still going on. You see these barrels there. They are the ore with some cyanide and trying still to get some gold out of it. So it's still going on, definitely in a smaller scale. But that, of course, leaves the interest on who started this gold mining there. And then we are back to the Hakka miners, of which you don't see much traces today. The Hakka miners started arriving from Sambas in the 1820s in very small groups, and establishing the 12th Kongsi in Bau. It grew quite slowly compared to what happened on the other side of the border. And about 1850, there was maybe around 1,000 miners there. But that year, it swelled. There came a huge influx of miners from the Sambas side, and it swelled until about 4,000 in less than a year. They basically came as huge groups. So what happened there? And if we look at it, they arrived in the 1850s, and in 87, 7 years later, they attacked Kuching in the big Chinese rebellion there. So it's quite unique. And maybe what interested in most was that in some of the publications you can find in Sarawak, they consider them freedom fighters. And I was like, hey, how many places in the world would you find people entering your border, establishing themselves on your land, and 7 years after attack your capital and call them freedom fighters? I know many places in the world where they'll be called something very different. So there's something slightly special about how all this is looked at. Spencer St. John is one of the officers of the Raja. Went there in 86, and he has a quite charming description of this Chinese settlement. He finds it very pleasant for the eye, from the scattered Chinese houses, each closely surrounded by beds of esculent flowers growing in the most luxurious manner. So the year before the attack on Kuching, it had looked quite nice. So 15 years earlier, the Raja had arrived in 1842. So he had been here for 15 years when the attack of Kuching came. And of course, they realized this influx of miners in 1850. And of course, that has to be brought to some sort of an order and some sort of an agreement how to function in Sarawak. And they didn't like that. And I'll come back to that, the experience from the other side. They didn't like somebody to tell them what to do whatsoever. What may be not realized very much is that if it would be allowed to stay and grow, it would have swelled to enormous amount. We'll see about that when we come to this, what happens on the other side. It would have been really many miners. And mines depletes, they becomes empty. And as we'll see, that means they move and take new areas as long as there's gold somewhere. So we had this attack in 1857, which were then also ended up becoming the end of the Hakka miners in Sarawak, because by the end after the attack and different stories about who was the hero during that event, the Hakka miners were sent back. They were attacked primarily by Dayak groups loyal to the Raja, and there was big massacres. A lot of them ended up being massacred, and the rest flew over. Most of the rest flew back to the Sambasana. From the Kongsi, there is not much left today. This is what we have. What, as far as we know, the only thing that can be seen. I don't even know. I haven't checked for recently if it's still there. This is the remains of the Kongsi flag post. The flag post of the Kongsi was one of the real mark of their autonomy and their power and their self-ruling. That was their flag post. And there was this remains of it, at least some years ago. So what we are talking about today is the mining areas. There were, is this what? Is this working also? Yeah. We had miners coming down here at Pontianak at Mandor site. We had in Mampawa, it's a small sultanate, also mining. And then we had the Sambas, all up here, areas where the main port for the gold was Xinjiang, and I'll also mention Kamchatka later. Here we have these mining areas. We have the down south we see the Padawan, and we see the Padawan, the Pontianak and the Mampawa areas. I won't come much back to that because I'll concentrate on the Sambas Sarawak areas, which is the big area up north. There is a big discussion about who actually invited the first miners. Some says it was the Pamemban of Mampawa, who invited 20 from Chinese from Brunei, whilst others say it was the Sultan of Sambas who invited 7 miners from Penang, or 7 Chinese from Penang. But a few words first about this Sultanate, Sambas. We have the area here, and we have the capital here, Sambas. At the time of the Kongsis, it was quite affluent city. It was, you see here the harbor of Sambas. It's quite active. There was a lot of things going on there. A lot of trade. This is from a Dutch visit to the Sambas in the 1820s. And we have one of the first photographs of the Sambas town. Not much different from how it looks in our time, like this. We have some more pictures of Sambas as it looks. Some of the fruits and commodities being transferred down from upriver to Sambas for reloading. And then we have the Kraton, which is the palace of this Sultanate in Sambas. Here we're talking to Mr. Hassan, who was the nephew of the last Sultan that was killed by the Japanese. And at that time still the palace looked very fine, and there's a lot of insignia there. The problem is now it's actually falling apart. There have been a lot of conflicts after the last Sultan died, because his son, as we see, that is the present Sultan to the right, he was not at age, and his mother was a commoner, so it couldn't be worse. And that, of course, started a fight about the throne of Sambas, which have had the different parts of the family entered the palace and wanted to stay there. And generally, it's really sad. There's a fantastic place and a fantastic number of unregistered insignia from back in time. It's losing. But I saw this one, and it started a complete new research for me. This one was a small drawing mentioning Mangatenga, Sultan Mangatenga, as the founding father of the Sambas dynasty. And Mangatenga was, as most of us will know, this so-called only Sultan of Sarawak we had before the Raja came. But what you see here is that the pedigree, the official stamp pedigree, we have Sultan Mangatenga. He had a son, Radin Sulaiman. And Radin Sulaiman became the Sultan of the first Muslim Sultan of Sambas under the name Sultan Tuanku Muhammad Safiuddin I. And since then, of course, that sparks a lot of considerations. So, if he actually had a son, and he actually became Sultan, what was his relation back to Sarawak? Wasn't there any relation there? And definitely there was. That's another story which we can use more time today. But definitely the relations between Sambas and Sarawak were much, at least as strength can be argued as it was ever with Brunei. But that's another story. Here we have his grave in Sambas, the son of Mangatenga, Sultan Safiuddin the first. Yeah. But just a few pictures, because he was the first Muslim ruler. But he was appointed, he married Sulaiman. Mangatenga went here, he settled down here. Oh. Now we have a, he didn't settle anywhere. He came back. But we'll have to do this short. But of course it was a Hindi kingdom when Manantena arrived with his wife from Sukadana and settled here. And the son, Sulaiman, got married to the daughter of the Hindu king. And that was how he, later on, it's a long story, became the first sultan of Muslim sultan of Sambas. And the father of this. For now we are at the museum, I can't help showing these pictures. It's so sad. We went up to the old capital for the Hindu kingdom because Sulaiman moved the capital to Sambas. It wasn't there before, it was up here. That when we were there, they're draining that area now. And you find these huge poles all over. You can see it's been a big place and it's all going to be destroyed and never excavated. So how old was this capital? And what was to find there? And when you start picking, you see all this huge amount of Chinese remains. Actually, definitely, it was worth doing some excavations there. But back to the Hakka miners. So why did the Sultan of Sarawak then invite them? The Hakkas is this area here. In southern China they come from. Maybe they come from the north of China and brought there during the Ming times to help quell some rebellions. But at least at this time here, they were lived in that area. And they were already organizing like kongsis there. And they were not called freedom fighters. The Ming emperors called these kongsis for bandits. There is the first record ever is this one. Soon they gathered hundreds and thousands of lawless elements. An oath was made to bind themselves into a brotherhood named Internal Prosperity. The brotherhood seized any good farmland that came into notice, but refused to be taxed by the government. Same story. They destroyed graveyards, occupied farms in the mining area. Lawless miners even appropriated the land rents or taxes of the government and landlords. In resistance to official arrest, they burned down houses, including the residence of the government. So formidable were they that they not only dared to arrest landlords and police officers, but also to kill the soldiers who had come to bring order. So this is the first record we have of these mining kongsis from China, 1640. Oh. I don't know. We have to go again. Then we can definitely remember it now because we've seen it several times. Yeah, this is, as we mentioned, this is a citation I gave was from the 1640. And it I would also come back to that. The interesting thing, because some have called these because they were very democratic. It was like everyone has a similar vote, that it was like a Western democracy, but it was much different, very different from that. Basically also because it was sworn by oath. So that loyalty you find in these ones, because you cannot betray, because you're giving your oath to the community. It's very different from this, where Western democracy would be much more me. But of course, internally it gives a huge strength that you have this, we are, whatever happens, we are together and we are into it together. But maybe not so nice for the neighbors, but internally, of course, it gives a big strength. So the first miners in Sambas were these few were these few coming from the first ones coming from Penang. Approximately the earliest grave we found in Montserrat, which is the area I'm talking about 1740. They started with building up small mines, and with maybe 20, a bit more or a bit less miners. And with that size, they could be controlled by the sultans. But they came in when there were gold there, and that's of course why the sultans invited them, because they know from Bangka, in Indonesia, another island, that they were good at finding gold. So they flew in big hordes, like here, 3,000 miners per year. So by the end of the day, they became, compared to the Sultan, very strong. By 1770, we have tens of thousands. And the mine starts merging into, from the 15 to 20 miners to 50 to 150 members. So they become much more difficult to deal with for the Sultan. Originally, when they came, this was the agreement. Okay, you can come, you can mine the gold. The gold is yours, but you have to get all your supplies and tools from me, of course, to a fair price. You can't do agricultural activities because they wanted to sell all the supplies to them. You cannot have firearms or gunpowder, and you have to pay a tribute. But already 10 years later, they had to, this was surrendered. There's no way when they become mining kongsis with, or shuis, as it was with these 200 miners, they become basically stronger than the Sultan. So by 1770 already, they only could agree upon some sort of a head tax, and the rest were in the pockets of the miners. So why did they become so damn strong in Sarawak? And there's a point on the last two bullets down there, that in other places where the kongsis also came, the sultans allied with the leaders of the kongsis. So they were the one collecting the values for the sultan and dividing the provision the other way. That meant that they actually became middlemen to exploit all the other miners. And their right to do that was based on their appointment of the sultans. So they had no interest in breaking with the sultans, because they would have legitimacy to become these exploiters of the other miners. But this happened here because the Samba sultans, or the three sultans in Pontianak, Mampower, and Sambas, wanted to take all the profit. So they didn't want to have a middleman. They wanted the Kongsi to pay directly. But that also meant that they had no one in the Kongsi to control how it developed and how it was, and what happened there. And that gave them a possibility to develop a very strong independence. This is the general opinion of one who made a book about this in 1994. The Hakka were freedom-loving and rebellious, and they were proud of what they were. The powerful tradition of resistance was particularly their pride. So if you gave them a chance, that might not be a good idea if you wanted to rule your sultanate and have your income. And the strength of how these kongsis developed, you can see that Takang, the big one in Montserrat, close to in the Sambas region, had always 3,000 men armed, ready for fight. Plus, everybody had to fight if the war came, but they had 3,000 that could be put in immediately. But all mining stopped when there was a war. And this was not only wars against the Dutch or against the Sultan, it was also internally. Of course there was fight, that's how they became bigger. They fought each other about the areas, about the mines, and so there becomes fewer and fewer and bigger kongsis. I will concentrate, because we see on the old maps, we see the Sambas town, and we see Montrado. Montrado became some sort of the center of the kongsis in West Kalimantan, in the Sambas area. Here we have a bigger, where you can see Mampawa and Sambas and Montrado. was the three big places. Montserrat was the central Kongsi. If we look at what happened there, in 1763 we had 24 huis. And after a war with the Bau Kongsi, which is down in Pontianak in Mandor, it was concentrated to 14. And after another huge internal war between these Montserrat Kongsis, where they defeated the Heaven and Earth Brotherhood Kongsi, there was 7 left. And now they made one huge Kongsi federation, the Huoshun, where we have had 2 big players, 2 main players. There was 14 or 7 all in all, but there were 2 main players, the Takang in Montserrat and the Shan Chiao Kuo in Siminis was the 2 dominant. And that's a bit important for our story. They were very, as I mentioned, democratic oriented. The leaders were appointed for 4 months, and after the 4 months they had to go back as miners. And then they had a small administration for it. They could be re-elected if they were popular, but they could also be thrown out earlier if they didn't perform. And all officers slept together in the Kongsi house. Just here something about what is their pride of their independence. The seal of the Kongsi was one thing, and the flag post. That's important. We saw the flag post in Bau. We have a description of the flag post in Kongsi from 1823 from Montserrat. They found a tall young tree with a bushy top erected in front of the Kongsi hall like a flagstaff. It was so impressive that it got a special mention in 2003. They all lived in this Kongsi house. There's a picture here of the Kongsi house, but that's in Mandor. It was not quite as democratic as in Montserrat. You can see the miners out to the right there, outside the walls and the fortresses, and not inside. It was a bit different, but there's no pictures of the one. But so what? We have already this, that it's not just democracy, it was sworn by oath. And the other component was that it was consensus driven. We have, maybe I could read a short. What this meant when Earl, an Englishman, visited the Kongsi in the 1820s. He had such a meeting. He suggested that the British and the Kongsis should make some trade agreements. And they had to discuss this in the Kongsi Hall. The Kongsi Hall were now filled with half-naked Chinese, each of whom considered themselves authorized to join in the discussion which ensued, and endeavored to make himself heard about his neighbors. The noise at least became perfectly deafening, and I was happy to escape it under the plea of wishing to inspect the town. So they were to the extreme. They were all miners and whatever had their opinion they could give. And I have already mentioned the short tenure of office, and all the administrators at any time could be sent back to the miners. Then started things to change. The Dutch entered in 1818 and established a small garrison in Sambas, actually on call by the Sultan of Sambas. And that was because they could not charge any taxes from the Chinese. And you saw from the first map, it's actually most of the Sambas Sultanate that was now run by the Chinese. They couldn't collect tax from them, and they couldn't collect tax from the Dayaks either, because they couldn't get into the territories because they were controlled by the miners. So they gave Dutch full authority over the Chinese against the retainer. In 1822, the Siminis, one of the 2 big parties, Shan Chiao Kuo, leaves the Montserrat alliance. This was a big shock. Suddenly this one breaks into 2. And it finds out it has more interest in join an allying with the Sultan and the Dutch, then to continually ally with Monterado. And that was basically because they found a lot of new gold ores in the Siminis, and they were starting depleting in the Monterado areas. And they got their own shipping port in Pamankat, which we saw on the first map. So now we had two parties, Santiago and Takang down in Monterado, with each their shipping harbor for the gold. The Takang was this area here, with the capital Monterado and Xinjiang as their shipping harbor. We have Pamankat up there, and we have Santiago, all this area here, and Sambas, just at the border of the Santiago. Well, the kongsis, of course, start eroding internally, because as years goes by, it's hard to be really equally. Some starts becoming more equal than others, and it started giving a power struggle inside that gives problems. And also they have to find other businesses, because the gold mining starts depleting, and that gives different roles. And somebody is not miners anymore, they earn other income. So, in 1850, something dramatic happens, and now you can see we are approaching the time for the arrival in Sarawak. The Dutch, together with the Sambas, blocks the harbor of Xinjiang, because the same as at Raja in Sarawak, you had to pay your taxes, and they didn't want to pay their taxes. And they got frustrated because the Dutch, they couldn't ship their gold out of Xinjiang. Basically, at the peak, 1/7 of the whole world's gold was shipped out through Xinjiang. So it was a lot of gold. But now these damn Dutch all claim their taxes, and they didn't want to pay. So they attack this other Santiago Kongsi, and this is the Kongsi then, who after they lose this battle and flee to Sarawak. So this is like, we can see this is one of the two warrior Kongsis in the Kalimantan side, where one is beaten and the miner starts fleeing over the border to Sarawak. The Takang do not only continue down the coast and take Pamankat. So now they have this other harbor also, and the miners flee to Sarawak. But now the Dutch completely block the coast, and the miners from Monterado, the whole army of now enters the coast to beat the Dutch away. They're not surrendering, definitely not. And this battle, you can find from records of the time, the Battle of Pamankat became a wild fight for which there are no comparable example in the military history of the Netherlands Indies. So it was, they were not giving up voluntarily. And actually, they were not beaten. The harbor and the town were taken by the Dutch, but and so they could keep the blockage of the harbor. But they couldn't take the mountain behind it. They were still kept. They were first taken by the Dutch, and then retaken by Takang. So they were in a position where it's like 1-1 after heavy battles, and then they suddenly withdraw. We can see from now, when one of the times we were down in Sambas, they wanted to show us something, and they have found more storages of, you can see the Chinese signs here, of cannons stored in the mountain from the Kongsi, Montserrat Kongsi. So they were definitely not leaving permanently. They were ready to come back. They put down their weapon storage on the mountain for later use. So they were very proud. I think it was in 2010 they found these different storages. So the end of it, suddenly the Tsakhang surrenders. So why did they do that? And it's clear now that it's because you had this talk I mentioned, this, the traders, there was no longer miners. They had interest in peace and trade. The miners has interested in mining and having the gold for themselves. So the Tokhas won that part of the battle, and they start negotiations with the Dutch. But the miners come back, get the majority, and say no, in 1952, we overturned the peace agreement. And then the Dutch send in heavy enforcements. And they take, firstly, Pamlicat and Singkawan, so they have no harbors. And then months later, the Montserrat itself falls to the Dutch. And this is, in principle, the end of the Hakka Mining Kongsi story. It's there are down in Mandor in Pontianak. It mingles on somehow 25 years more before that's also finally closed by the Dutch. But here in this area, it ends. There are still some fighters in the mountain, which is rounded up in 1857. So at this time, in this whole area, there's only one Kongsi left. That's the 12th Kongsi in Bau, which then definitely ends its life in the year after, in February 1857, when we had the rebellion. What you can see now was that probably, if this had not happened, it would have all these miners that had been losing in the period from 1854 to 1856 would most likely have crossed the border. They were miners, they would continue to, if they had been allowed and not been stopped, the whole movement, there was gold here, it was depleting on the Indonesian side, would have continued on this side. And after 54, it becomes the assistant residency of Montserrat as a Dutch residency. But let's take a tour and see what we can find nowadays. So here we are in Singkawan. We find that at this Chinese temple, we were told, were actually the main trading place for the gold in the 1840s and the 1830s. And it's, as I mentioned, it's huge amounts. It's 1/7 of the gold in the whole world that went through here. Now you see, when we look at the harbor, and this would be a trading harbor, you see the new bulwarks down and not much water. But you see old pictures, there were more water there. It would have been possible for ships to go in. Now it's basically siltated. So it looked weird. There we have some of the old Dutch colonial buildings. This is the post house, still there at the harbor area. And we could see there have been a number of big warehouses for all this trade. There was one left, or let's say remains of one left. It was given to the war from the heroes from the war to stay in, and it was simply just demolishing. You can see when we were there, they didn't have any money, and there was about 40 families in there, and you could hardly call it a shelter anymore. But in a few years, it wouldn't be much of a shelter. They had absolutely, but it was the last of the warehouses from the high years, the hay time of the Hakka hay trade. See some of it here. But now we wanted to go to Montserrat because, stupid as it was and ignorant, we would expect to find the Chinese there, because the Dutch were not interested in the Chinese to leave. They were interested in them to stay and dig gold just to pay their tax. So we would go up and see what we could find there. So Xinjiang is here. So it's a couple of hours from the coast and into Montserrat. Problem was, Montserrat was not of any of our maps. But of course we had guys with us who said, we can find Montserrat. No, on the maps, never mind. It had been around 30,000 inhabitants in the Kongsi area, so there must be quite a big city there still. Yeah, I think we will just skip this one. Then we suddenly said, this is Montserrat. And there was this street. I said, this is just a diet village. This is not anything, no China sign, no nothing here. And just this one road. It was like, we were very surprised. Maybe we would have checked more, we would have known more, but there was nothing there. It's just a diet village. And we started talking to people about it. They had no idea what we were talking about. But then we saw this. You remember the talks about the flag posts in Bau, the flag post in the original one in Montserrat. And we said, this is a Hakka flag post. So it must be right. And when you go close to it, you can see what it says. It said, Dina Hikan, born in 1766. It was when this Hoshun, this combined Kongsi were made. And Diba Kaiti, restored 1966. So somebody was still taking care of it, even though there was not a single Hakka there. But later we found out, of course, it was the Hakka society in Xinjiang that maintained the flag post. But we then started discussing with them, and we're sitting having some lunch, and slowly some of them, something about mining. Yeah, we know where there was old mines, and that's long ago, hundreds of years. We don't know who, but there was mines here. And they said, we'll bring you to here. And this proved to be the first mine, actually, which is now, you know much mine over it anymore, of the Montserrat. But of course, it's basically sluicing and panning of gold from the sediments. But then we come further into the areas, and we see something is still going on here. Basically eating up still huge areas for a tiny little bit of gold. You see the lady down there sitting and panning. We have a bit closer here. So we had to see how much gold she could make in a day. It's approximately a bit less than half a gram or $3 a day she could earn from this. So the gold, to some extent, was still there if you had small requirements. And there's also remains that has been more town here, and there has been more official places here. They suddenly said, we have something you should see. And we came to this monument, which was now falling into these holes they were making for the mine. But we had to crawl over the water to read it. It's been huge on both sides. And it stated that this is in remembrance of the fallen in Montserrat, 1856, 1914, 1854. So up and down in the age. And then one more year which couldn't be read anymore. So there is some remembrance of from the Dutch time here, of the old Kongsi wars. But it's gone now. And I think this was one of the few remaining. Most were already gone, disappeared, because there might be some gold underneath of what was the old Montserrat. But then somebody said, we know an even more interesting monument. And so they took their motorbikes along, and we on our four-wheel drive behind them as good as we could follow, and then walked over these endless plains of mud and whatever, and came to this hill. And suddenly they didn't know where it was, and we were certain they couldn't find it. And it's only when we come back to Montserrat, we realized that two of the participants, there was a lot following us all the time. They were just very interested. They didn't know anything about this. So they said, they knew the monument, but they also knew that there were rumors that there was gold beneath the monument. And of course we were not coming just to see a stupid monument. We were coming to dig the gold under the monument. So no way. So they convinced the others, you don't dare show them where that monument is. So we lost that one. But you see the endless areas out there. But we continued walking and to see where there were more industrialized mining still going on, where they're pouring in water and then sucking it up together with the sediments. And then to these apparatus, you see down there where the water is running down and the gold is settling. Still going on, but they had no idea this was not always done by the dyads. So after that, we wanted to continue to this Seminis Xiao Kongsi, which was the one that fled to Sarawak. You couldn't find anything. You could find something here like this. Is Songhai Seminis. This is the only sign of anything left of Seminis. But they helped us take a straton in Sambas and brought us to see where it was. Here you see some of the old roads still remaining from the Kongsi times. And you see there was a huge Chinese graveyard, but no inhabitation anymore. It had been completely destroyed in that war in 1850. But definitely this was the place. They told us and showed us that this was old from the Kongsi time. And then like Tasik-Biru, of course you have lakes which you might not be very healthy to swim in, but they didn't know. There will be arsenic there because this mining was going on also after the panning time. Then it was what we could see. This is what is left of these miners. Their Kongsi when they came to Sarawak. This was this piece of road and the Chinese graveyard. So then we went down to the Permankat at the coast, which was, it's also completely overgrown. Most of them you can't see anymore. And basically no remembrance what this is. You're lucky to find somebody who even know it's there. Like all this history is forgotten. But we couldn't really help being still wondering, why were there no Chinese left in Monterado? And slowly we also, of course, we already know it had something to do with the Suharto and new economic, the New Deal, Suharto, that he wanted to clear the inland of Chinese. This is the areas of red. You see, this is this area around Sambas, where it proves that it shows up that actually the Dutch, the Suharto. Let me say it the next one, maybe it's easier. At the first, the Chinese were attacked by the Dyaks, and actually a lot of the Chinese flees already here. But they're not looting, they're not destroying anything, just attacking. Obviously with the purpose to get them away. The policy of the Suharto was to get them down to the coast. They didn't want any Chinese in the interior because they could be communists, all of them. So here in Sarawak, you put them into protected towns. You can see what they did on the other side of the border was quite some more consequent. So that did then help to make all of them move. A second raid of the Dayaks started in November '67. This was another groups of Dayaks which came from the interior. They were armed, and later on you can see from, especially from Australian atrocity reports that they were basically armed by the military, and they were honored the ones who took Chinese heads, and basically they were promised that the land they could take from the Chinese, they could keep. So this time it became really, really violent. So this is the what I mentioned, but also the conclusion that direct raids had emptied the inland Chinese district of Chinese who have lived here since Kongsi times. So there must be somewhere, because they could not all be killed. We know that many of them were killed, but it was basically not necessary to kill them for Suharto. He wanted them down to the coast. So when there was the Xinjiang, Permankat and Sambas were protected by the military. And there was a stream, I'll show that later, outside Xinjiang. If they passed that one, they were safe, because the Dayaks were not allowed to go in there. So after some years, we got some notes how to find them, because the ones that managed to flee must be somewhere, so we can get some interviews about what happened. And I think 3 or 4 years later, we got to know about this Kampong Perungsi, or they call it Kampong Selamat, where they have 40 families which has been fleeing from the direct raids were living. There are still no roads there. You'll see we are walking. It's about half an hour walk to get into that kampong there. And they were still scared. There was still some, they were not interested in, they were still worried what could happen. It was in '69. We talked, this is the first guy, the guy to the right we talked to. He was 36 years old when the attack came. And he explains, basically they don't only speak Kek still. So this is the daughter-in-law that helps us translate here. He was 36 years when the attack came. And they had to flee by nighttime with their 4 kids. Crossing the river while the Dayaks were arrested. And they didn't have any babies, but the families that fled with them, that had babies, had to leave the babies behind because they could start crying. And if the Dayaks heard they were coming, they would be killed. So this was like, and they said just when they crossed the river, it was red already of blood. So it has been many killed. But they managed to flee. They then came down to Singkawan and were transferred after some months to this place. And each family got a 20 times 50 square meter plot to do veggies. That's not much in a swampy area. And they came with the 4 kids, but to be sure they could all survive, they had to give 3 of them away for adoption, because they couldn't, no way they could pay. Just one more example is this guy. He was 16 years when the raids took place. His father was a rubber tapper and had observed from somebody coming running that these Dayaks from the interior were approaching. So he managed to run home and get him safe, and him and the kids and the wife safe into the American missionary church. So they stayed there for 1 week before the military came and brought them down to Singkawan, where they stayed in a warehouse for another year before they were transported to the same Kampong Perungsi, some here. Yeah. This is the big river, which is the limits of how the Dayaks could go. If you could cross this one, you were safe. And 1 hour is gone. and all the Hakka miners is gone too. So I think with this I will end the story of the Hakka miners and the relations to the Bau Kongsi.
Thank you, Ib Larsen, for an insightful presentation. Now it's time for our Q&A session. Please introduce yourself and prepare just one question for the speaker.